refreshing, encouraging, and to say, yes, that's our God.
Amen.
He is faithful like that. Amen. Well, let's turn to Nehemiah chapter 2. We looked at Nehemiah 1 last time, so I figured why not continue into Nehemiah chapter 2. And as you're turning there, I just wanted to let you know that on the way here, Brother Prasad and I were having a good discussion about the sovereignty of God, and you know that that's always a very easy and simple discussion. We have all the answers. Just kidding. That's a very difficult topic to get into, and just wrestling through some of the difficult things that are attached to that, and understanding His sovereignty, man's accountability. And I was telling Brother Prasad yesterday, in fact, that I had written a short book called Evil and Suffering in a Sovereign God's World, because we've wrestled through these things and people ask those kinds of questions to us. Well, if God is sovereign, if He's in control, He is infinite and so on, where does evil come from? Is He the author of evil? How does it exist? And those kinds of things. So I put together a short book. It's under 100 pages. I like to write short because today we just don't have the time to read John Owen, like these big volumes. But there are copies of this for free on the back table there. So anyone who's interested in, if you like, at the end of the service, just take one. I have other ones in a box here if those run out. But so it's yours if you'd like to. Just the only thing I request is read it if you take it. Well, with that said, let's turn then to Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah chapter 2, and we will be looking at this whole chapter. What I want to do before we read any of the text, I want to pray with you and just give a brief introduction and then start to read with you through this text rather than read through the whole thing twice. We'll read through sections at a time and go through it. Those of you who were here last time that I preached, I went through chapter 1, but even if you weren't, you'll be able to follow along. It's not the end of the world. And so you'll see hopefully where we're going. So let's pray. Father, we do give you thanks for your word. We thank you for the power of your word and how your Holy Spirit uses your word to teach us, to instruct us, to convert us, to lead us, Lord, into all truth and to change our lives. We thank you, Lord, that as we know we can't trust in our own reasoning, our own logic, our own ability to discern your will, that you have given us a book outside of ourselves through servants that you have indwelt, Lord, and that your Spirit has used as your vehicle to express your will to us so that we can learn and know what you would have us do and to understand the gospel and all that comes out of that. And so, Father, we do pray as we look at Nehemiah chapter 2 that you would have a word for us today and that we would, when we leave here, that we would be changed even more so and be better equipped to serve you and that you would grow us in your grace. Lord, so we do ask that you would forgive us for our sins. We continue to pray for the grace that you've given us all along, that you would continue to shower us with that grace, even now as we seek to understand your will in this book. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Well, last time I was here, we looked at Nehemiah chapter 1 and considered the burden which Nehemiah had felt to help his people rebuild the wall of Jerusalem after hearing, if you recall, some of his countrymen who were at Jerusalem, who were involved with the rebuilding work there, and who had gone back to Jerusalem. We know that many Jews didn't go back, but there were droves that had gone back for many years. They rebuilt the temple, and they had not rebuilt the wall yet. And so Nehemiah is not in Jerusalem. He is serving the king of Persia across the river Euphrates. He is beyond there, and so he has to get feedback on how the people are doing. And so he has a couple of brothers from his hometown there in Jerusalem come to him, and they inform him that the people are in disarray, that they're very discouraged, that the wall is just a mess, that the people aren't even encouraged to rebuild anymore, and that things are not going well. And so Nehemiah is in Shushan, as I said. He's up in the area of Persia. He is serving as the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes there, and he now has this burden to help the people. He is concerned for them after he gets this news. And so he faces a great dilemma because he was not in a position where he could just freely go back to help the people rebuild, since he had secured an important position in the court of the king. He was the cupbearer. He had an important role there. He couldn't just leave and go as he wanted to, but yet he had this burden. And so what does he do? The best thing that a man of God could do, we saw this in chapter 1, a good portion of the text there is devoted to giving us his prayer. He prays. He goes to God and he prays. And he seeks God's grace and help, hoping that God would move the king's heart, King Artaxerxes' heart, to grant favor to Nehemiah so that he would allow Nehemiah to go back and to lead the people, to stir them up, to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, to encourage them and to get them back on track with rebuilding Jerusalem. Well, this afternoon we're going to consider now, we're going to continue on into chapter 2, where Nehemiah is now going to stand before the king. So he's prayed, he's going to give that request, and he's going to pour out his heart before the king, and he will, of course, get the king's approval so that he can go back to Jerusalem for a time to rebuild this wall and to work with the people. But that said, as we ought to expect, even as Nehemiah seeks to be faithful, what we find in chapter 2 right away is that opposition also begins to arise at the same time. And this will try his faith. And we'll see that, you'll see that throughout the whole book of Nehemiah. And it leads then him to affirm the sincerity of his faith and trust in God. So we see this, the faith of this man, that God continues to strengthen his faith and try his faith and to build him up through these trials. And then it's especially right here, as we see Nehemiah's faithfulness and his persevering, that I think we'll find a wonderful treasure trove of encouragement for us as we seek to faithfully press on in our rebuilding efforts and your rebuilding efforts here at Rock Church as you seek to build the Church of Jesus Christ. And so now with that said, let's look first at verses 1 through 8 and see what happens as Nehemiah stands before the king. So we're told that it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart." So I became dreadfully afraid and said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad, when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste and its gates are burned with fire?" Then the king said to me, "What do you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Furthermore, I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, and for the house that I will occupy." And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. And so here we find, looking at these 8 verses here to start, Nehemiah is coming before the king. Again, he is the cupbearer, and he sets the king's wine before him to drink. But he is incapable of hiding the deep grief and sadness that he feels for his people. He can't hide it. It's evident that he is in deep sorrow. And furthermore, we're told that Nehemiah had never before come into the presence of the king with such a sad countenance. Now, while we might surmise that Nehemiah's relationship with the Lord was that which enabled him to serve the king with contentment and joy, and that's true. God has a way of giving us encouragement and joy so that we can serve in any situation. It is also important to realize that it was a very dangerous thing to enter into the king's presence with anything less than a cheerful demeanor. You could be killed in a very severe way if you brought any type of grief to the king, any kind of sadness to the king, just by your demeanor or your counsel even. And so one could be put to death if he came before the king with a sad countenance, which is why we're told that Nehemiah became dreadfully afraid when the king noticed that he was sad, right? Why else would he be afraid? If I was sad in your presence and you noticed, I wouldn't be afraid if you questioned me on that. But when you're the king of a nation like Persia, at that time, that could be a fearful thing. And so, knowing that Nehemiah was not sick, the king knew he wasn't sick in any way, in other words, he didn't have any physical illness, he was able to deduce that this sadness was due to some form of depression. Now that's even worse. See, it's one thing if you were sad, you had some kind of pneumonia or cancer or disease, it's understandable, and even then they would take you out of the king's presence. But this was depression under his reign. He was depressed as someone who was working in his court. That could be an insult to the king. And so he asked Nehemiah, why is your face so sad? This is not sickness, this is sorrow of heart. Why are you sad? And although he was full of fear, by the grace of God, Nehemiah was able to pour out his heart before the king without holding back. He didn't lie, he let it out, and he explained what was on his heart. Indeed, in fact, his response in itself, his willingness to speak the truth of the grief that grieved him, was an act of faith, which I believe Nehemiah was standing upon the prayer that he had made in chapter 1, and taking that step of faith and relieving his heart to the king. And so first, he begins by saying wisely something that anyone would say in a sense of loyalty to the king, but here we can see why it would also make sense before he pours out his heart. He first says, may the king live forever. So it begins there, which was a wise preface to his response because it showed both Nehemiah's commitment to the king and the fact that his grief had nothing to do with any wrong done by the king or the king himself. Important for Nehemiah to say, look, it's got nothing to do with you. I'm not in any way unhappy under your leadership and your rule. And so he needed to establish that so that the king would not think in the slightest way that Nehemiah was unhappy or discontent with the king and his treatment of Nehemiah or in the quality of his reign. And so, yes, it was a common phrase. Most people would say that out of respect to the king. May the king live, long live the king. David said that to Solomon, and etc. But no doubt, Nehemiah was also concerned what the king might wrongly presume that he was the cause of Nehemiah's grief, which he wasn't. Well, moving on then, Nehemiah brings forth his burden. He says, well, why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste and its gates are burned with fire? And so Nehemiah informs the king that his grief is bound to the terrible condition within which Jerusalem, his city of heritage, remained. He was grieving for his people, for the place of his ancestry and his history. He had a sincere grief, though, we see that here, don't we? And burden for his people and for his homeland, which was laid waste, in spite of the fact that many had gone back to rebuild in years past. Remember, this is over 10 years since the time that the temple was built during Ezra. So the people have been back in the land for a good amount of time now. And Nehemiah hoped to see things progress, even if he wasn't there. He loved his people and his nation and wanted to see them prosper. And here he sees they're at a dead end. That there's no building going on. That it's the people are utterly depressed. The wall is still burnt down. The city is still suffering greatly. And the people are depressed. So he is concerned. Well, hearing this then, the king then asks the question to Nehemiah when he hears Nehemiah express this. And this question, when Nehemiah hears it, he knows that how he answered this question could very well lead to his death if the king is unhappy with his answer. It may seem, again, like a small thing to us, but appreciating that time period and that setting, this is a big deal here. And so we're told in verse 4, then the king said to me, what do you request? That's a loaded question. Well, what are you asking, Nehemiah? You're grieving. You say, well, what do you want? So Nehemiah knows that the moment of truth has arrived. And so what does he do? Well, we're told there, so I prayed to the God of heaven. What a wonderful thing. Yeah, he offers that great prayer in chapter 1. But even here, we find that even for a few moments at least, because he's got to answer the king, he can't wait too long, in some way he quickly offers up a short, silent prayer to God before making his request. Right? And so here we even have a sense of validation that it's okay to have short prayers. Right? Don't always have to pray long prayers. Short prayers are fine, and there's a place for that. And God is gracious and hears our prayers. Right? Remember the parable that Jesus gave of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee had that long-winded prayer about how righteous he was, and what did the tax collector do? Lord, just have mercy on me, the sinner. Couldn't even look up. Not a lot of words in that prayer, but it was a prayer that God heard nonetheless. And so Nehemiah offers this prayer. Following this, he brings forth his request to go back and to help the people for a time to rebuild. And of course, we see, and we don't want to forget, and Nehemiah acknowledges this, we don't want to forget when you go through the book of Nehemiah all the times that he says, the good hand of the Lord was upon me, that the Lord had done this, the Lord had put it in my heart. Don't lose those words in Nehemiah or in any of the books of the Bible. Brother Prasad made that clear in his testimony. I think we all got the picture there that the Lord was the one who was at work there. But we see that here in Nehemiah as well. And so the Lord answers his request and grants him favor from the king, who grants him this request, as we saw in verse 6. But furthermore, recognizing as well that he'll have to deal with opposition. He knows, Nehemiah, that he's going to have to deal with opposition, especially when he crosses the river and goes into the promised land, when he's not in the king's dominion. And it's the king's dominion, but when he's not directly right where the king is, he's got other governors that he's going to have to deal with who are not favorable to the Jews. So he has to be prepared for that. And they didn't have the internet and cell phones then, so that the king could say, hey, by the way, do this. He had to go there with some way of showing them, the people in the land, that he had the king's approval. And so what does he do? He then requests letters of authentication from the king, as well as certain needed resources. He has permission to get timber from the king's forest so that he could use it to build the citadel, the part of where the temple was, and also for the wall and for his own house. So Nehemiah is taking this request thing a little far, isn't he? Not just to go, but he's saying, also, can you give me these words of authentication from you with your seal, some resources that I could use in the forest so that we can rebuild, because they didn't have those kinds of resources in Jerusalem. But then notice again how Nehemiah acknowledges, as I said, in verses 7 to 9, when you come to the end of that text there, verse 8, notice again, Nehemiah acknowledges that this great favor from the king, because the king grants these requests, is nothing short of God's gracious hand of blessing working favorably for Nehemiah. So what do we see here in this short form so far? Just the 8 verses we read. We see Nehemiah acting in faith. He's acting in faith in a very difficult circumstance. God meets his faith, and Nehemiah acknowledges then, as God meets his faith with this blessing, he grants him the heart of the king, grants him the king's favor. Nehemiah acknowledges God's blessing and providential working in the heart of the king to grant Nehemiah all of these requests. So we have that reciprocal worship and acknowledgement of God that comes back as he answers prayer. And the king granted them to me according to not the king's heart, right? Not according to his own desire, but according to the good hand of my God upon me. Well, then let's continue on and look at verses 9 and 10. And considers a couple things about Nehemiah's journey to Jerusalem. So now he has the permission. He's got these letters of authentication. He's on his way now to Jerusalem. A couple things on the way that I want to look at with you as we work through this text. So look at verses 9 and 10. We're told, then I went to the governors in the region beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official, so these are some guys within those governors' quarters, people of great influence, when they heard of it, they were deeply disturbed, listen to this, that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. What a horrible, wretched picture of the reality of man's rebellion against God and his people. They were grieved, they were disturbed that somebody wanted to help the people of Israel. And so here we have a few important details before Nehemiah gets to Jerusalem, just on the journey there. And let's just note a couple things. First, we find that he wisely goes directly to the governors, who makes that wise decision, whom the king had set over the people on the other side of the river, so that they would be aware of the king's authorization for allowing Nehemiah to lead the people to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. He couldn't just go in there and start rebuilding, and people were like, What's going on? Who allowed you to do that? This is not, you have no permission from this, or how can you do this? It's not your territory, it belongs to the king. Well, that's why he went to the leadership and said, look, this is from the king. And by doing that, he would seek to assure the safety of the people and keep the governors and those who were there from in any way trying to hinder that work. And so Nehemiah had the backing of the king. So very wise move that he makes. In fact, he should have incurred their help and their protection of those governors, knowing that the king had authorized what Nehemiah was doing. Of course, we see already that there were some there who were against him. Number two, secondly, the king went over and above Nehemiah's request. Do you see that here? Nehemiah made certain requests, bold to ask to go. That was one thing. That was tough enough. Then he asked for these authorization letters and then some timber and wood from the king's forest. But we find also that the king sent captains of his army and horsemen with Nehemiah to accompany him on this long journey. King sends his own resources to go with Nehemiah. And so this was another blessing from God, answering Nehemiah's prayer beyond what he could even have imagined, as the king utilized his own resources to secure the safety of Nehemiah as he sought to carry out his desire to serve God and his people. And God will do that sometimes with his church. He will use even people within the government or those in high places who are heathen even, or outside, to help bless and secure his people's safety. He does that here with the king. And then thirdly, just thinking about some of the information here about the journey to Jerusalem, as we would expect, right from the outset, we find, and this, we're going to take note of this, especially when we get to application, we find opposition beginning to arise as Nehemiah strives to serve the Lord in his faithful endeavors, right? Here comes the opposition. No sooner than he wants to do good, he gets that granted, that request, and opposition is starting to stir as well. And brethren, we'll go over this again in a short time, but note, it will always be the case that opposition rooted in the devil's designs to ultimately contend with God, it will always be the case that opposition will greatly be disturbed whenever anyone seeks to glorify God by attempting to promote the welfare of his people. You want to do good for the people of God? Don't be surprised if opposition is going to come against you. That's going to happen. And so we see that in our own country, don't we? People are always happy when Christians are miserable. And they would do all that they can to hinder their faithful desire to serve their God and their Savior. People in the world, what are they trying to do now in this country? It's not enough that they want us to accept, right, the ungodly things that are being accepted by the culture at large. In other words, they want us not to speak against homosexuality and transgenderism and all these kinds of things, and abortion. They don't want us to say anything against those things. But then furthermore, they want us to support them. So they want us to bake our cakes for them. They want us to secure marriage certificates for them. They want us to approve. They want us to violate our consciences because they hate the people of God. And it's interesting that even with the difficulties that we have faced through Islam and the attacks that have come upon our land, that people are more favorable toward Islam, even still, than Christianity. And so it is pretty fascinating to see that. Well, needless to say, opposition is aroused wherever faithfulness is espoused. You will always have opposition. Well, let's move on then to Jerusalem. So that's kind of as Nehemiah standing before the king. There he is on his way to Jerusalem, some things that we see happening. And now verses 11 to 16, let's see what happens when Nehemiah first comes to Jerusalem and move on to his desire to rebuild, and we'll see what happens as we move to the later part of this chapter. So let's read verses 11 to 16. He says, "So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, and I and a few men with me. I told no one what God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, nor was there any animal with me except the one on which I rode." So he wasn't making a commotion here. He was doing something very privately for a little bit. "And I went out by night through the valley gate to the serpent well and the refuse gate, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were burned with fire. And then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal under me to pass. So I went up in the night by the valley and viewed the wall. Then I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the others who did the work. Then I said to them, you see the distress that we're in. Well, let's stop there. Let's stop at verse 16 for a moment before we get to what happens next. So, just looking at his opening, the way that he begins to conduct himself when he first gets there, we find that when Nehemiah gets to Jerusalem, at first, he doesn't tell anyone what his intentions are for being there, right? He's keeping things silent first. And the reason he's doing that is he wants to wisely, quietly assess the damage and determine exactly what kind of work needs to be done before seeking to arouse the people to this great task. He's very wise. It's a good leadership principle there. Rather than just spilling everything out immediately, what your intentions, your thoughts are, throwing the plan out, just being slow to do that and making sure that you have a full understanding of things, a full assessment before you reveal that plan. And so he spends 3 days, we're told, he's examining the condition of the city wall. And to sum up his findings, it's an absolute mess. Right? I mean, that's the short year 2018 version. It's a mess. It's a disaster. A lot of work has to be done. First of all, removing all of the burnt up and destroyed unusable rubble. That's still there. The rubble and all that's been destroyed is still there, and it's useless. Before they can even begin to build, they have to remove what's still there that's useless. In fact, we're told at one point, in verse 14, I believe it is, in verse 14, Nehemiah has to get off of his animal. He can't even go any further with the one animal he has because there's just too much rubbish in the way. He can't get through. And so he has to leave the animal and now go in on foot and make his way maneuvering around through this rubbish that is there, this rubble. But at least now, having assessed things, he can bring forth a plan. He sees the damage. He understands what's in play here. And so now when he seeks to motivate the people to the task of rebuilding, he'll be prepared to have a plan, to be able to answer their questions, to be able to say, look, I've seen the damage. I know. I'm aware of things. As opposed to if he just came in there, having not looked at anything, and then they start saying you have no idea, or whatever it might be, he is ready to address them. He has been wise. He knows the status of the wall and can offer intelligent and realistic counsel on how they're to accomplish this difficult and tedious task. So then, let's move into verses 17 and 18 and see now what he does. He's made the assessment. He knows what's involved. He sees it. He's faced it. I'm sure he's prayed in there somewhere as well. We're not told all the time, but I'm sure he has. But verses 17 and 18, now he's ready to address the leadership and the people there. So he says, then I said to them, you see the distress that we're in, how Jerusalem lies waste and its gates are burned with fire. Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. So let's stop there for a moment, just right there in verse 18. So finally, having assessed the situation, Nehemiah now is ready to call the people to action. And he does so in a very just a wise way that he addresses this. First, he highlights the problem, doesn't he? He says, look where we're at, verse 17, right? He highlights the problem and he says, look, you see the distress we're in. How Jerusalem lies waste. The walls are burned with fire. Look at where we're a reproach. We don't want to be this, but let's rebuild again. So he's acknowledging the problem. And then secondly, he calls them to action to fix the problem. So here's the problem. Let's rebuild. Let's do something about this. Let's get up and work. But then, thirdly, he doesn't leave it there. Because if you just hear that, my temptation would be like, okay, Nehemiah, go ahead, you get started. Why don't you get it done? But then he gives them, thirdly, he encourages them onto this task. He gives the problem, calls to action, but he encourages them to this task by revealing to them how God's hand was upon Nehemiah to bless him in this endeavor. He told them about how the hand of God had been upon them. And this would go a long way in affirming to the people that God would be with them as well as they work with Nehemiah to rebuild the wall. Now, I don't know about you. If there's a difficult task involved in what we need to